8 stories driving at night. Story 1. When this specific incident occurred, I was 29 years old and was driving a relatively short distance with my 5-year-old daughter. My husband and I had made plans to drive to their parents' house out of town and stay with them for a couple of weeks. My husband worked late into the day, so we agreed that it would be best for my daughter and I to leave first and have him follow us a couple of hours later. It was winter, so it was getting dark early. We left around 3 in the afternoon, and by 4:30 it was completely dark outside. We were still an hour and a half away from my in-laws' house, and I felt pretty confident that we would get there without anything bad happening. It's not that I had a hunch or anything, but as a mother, it's definitely something I thought about in the back of my mind. We were driving down a back road that had no street lights and was completely desolate. I didn't necessarily love the feeling of being completely alone, but I did my best to just ignore it and keep telling myself that we would get there before I knew it. We had driven this road countless times before, and nothing had ever happened to us. We were 30 minutes from the house when I began to see flashing lights in the distance. There were 2 flashing yellow lights in the middle of the road that I quickly recognized as hazard lights on a car. I started to feel an unpleasant feeling, and I just didn't like the fact that they weren't stopped on the side of the road, but were in the middle of it. I stopped somewhere between 25 and 30 yards away and began to think about what I should do. I was sure of one thing, however. There was no way I was going to stop to help these people. I mean, she was a woman in her late 20s alone with her young daughter. I'd have to be a furious madwoman to stop and help someone. I would call for help later, but that was the best I could really do. I'm sure any other woman in my position would feel the same way. You have to put the safety of yourself and your child first before that of a stranger, always. I stood there for what felt like 30 minutes and still had no idea what to do. I had no service, so calling my husband or father-in-law was not an option. Eventually, I made the decision to just turn around and go home to wait for my husband so we could drive there together. The only problem was that it was a 2-lane road, and it would take me more than the 3-point maneuver to turn around and start backing up. I began to doubt, but when I looked in the rear-view mirror, I noticed shadows rapidly approaching in the distance behind my car. He could see them slightly in the moonlight, but he couldn't make out what they were. They had come about 10 yards behind my car when I realized they were people, and I think they were carrying something. I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't even think. It was as if my body reacted before my brain did. I put the car in gear and put the pedal to the metal. It wasn't an extremely fast car or anything like that, but it did what I needed it to do. I was speeding straight into the stopped car and had no choice but to drive to the side of the road past them as best I could. As I was passing, I saw more people starting to pull out of the side of the road. They started throwing things, pretty much anything that could make me stop. I hit one of the people and he fell back to the ground. Something hit my windshield and even cracked a bit, and whatever was flew into the passenger seat. I screamed from the impact and felt bad because my screams made my daughter start screaming and crying, and I told her that everything was going to be okay. But she was 5 years old and nothing I could say at that moment was going to make her feel better. I just kept driving forward without taking my foot off the gas. I was trying to increase the distance as much as possible between us and those people, and before I knew it, we were getting to my in-laws' street. They had a security gate at the entrance, and I pressed a button to let us in, and they immediately noticed I was in distress when they responded to the gate. They let us in, and my father-in-law greeted me at the entrance with his gun. I was crying, and my daughter was sobbing on her grandmother's shoulder. They took us inside, and I told them everything that had happened. My father-in-law has always been very protective of me and my daughter, and I could tell how angry he was getting. I kept wondering if we had been followed there, and honestly, I had no idea. I had been paying attention to the cars behind me, Just focus on getting to their house where I knew we would be safe. My in-laws are the type of people who take their safety very seriously. They have countless firearms and security cameras everywhere, inside and outside their home and property. They checked the cameras and noticed that the same car passed in front of the gate several times, as if it were driving down the street, turning around and returning multiple times. We decided it was time to call the police, but when they did, they said they couldn't do anything for us since it was technically not an emergency, and it was outside the city limits. I guess when you live far enough away from the boundaries of where the local police normally serve, they can only help in life or death situations. My father-in-law told them very explicitly that if anyone entered their property, they would be shot on the spot. They told him that it was within his rights, and that was it. They armed me and my mother-in-law and told us to wait inside the house. They called my husband, who was still an hour away, and they went out to check on the property. We watched the security cameras, and just as he was approaching the gate, the car stopped again, but this time it stopped right at the gate. Two people got out of the car and clearly hadn't seen my father-in-law approach the gate. They tried to push it open, and since we couldn't hear what was going on, all we saw was my father-in-law running towards them and firing a shot into the air. We could see that he was yelling something at them, but we didn't know what. They hurried back to the car and drove away quickly. We weren't sure if they would come back, but I had a feeling that was it. My husband arrived at the house an hour later and continued to continually apologize to me for having me drive alone. But I kept telling him that it wasn't his fault and that the result would have been the same if he had been with us. We were safe, and that's what mattered. A couple of days later, we heard the news that there had been some car thefts in the area, but thankfully no one was seriously injured in the process. It still horrifies me to think about what would have happened if I hadn't seen those people sneaking up behind the car. What would they have done? I don't even want to know. I'm thankful that we're okay, and I'll say that I don't drive anywhere at night without protection, whether it's my husband or a gun. Story 2. So, I found that online dating can be crazy. Let me say that before I say anything else. You see photos of someone online, talk for a while, and then get to know them, not even knowing for sure if they're the person in the photo. It really is absolutely insane. I wish I had known that before downloading Tinder myself. I had gone on a few dates with guys I met on Tinder, but nothing worked. Most guys just wanted casual hookups or weren't ready to commit. Of course, there are also some rare ones, but I didn't meet those kinds of people too often. After having Tinder for a few months, I met a guy on the app who seemed too good to be true. He was absolutely handsome, and when he messaged me, I was very excited. I got even more excited the more we talked, when I realized we had a lot in common. He was very kind and funny, and from what he told me about himself, he really seemed like my ideal guy, you know? After a week of talking, he asked me if I wanted to go out. I suggested a bar near my house, but he wanted to go to dinner instead. I usually like to have a drink on the first date, so I can leave quickly if it goes wrong. But I liked this guy so much and he looked different, so I agreed to go to dinner. For anonymity purposes, we will call him Nathaniel. I was going to go to the restaurant myself, but he insisted on picking me up, saying it was the right thing to do as a gentleman, and so on. It wasn't the best idea to say yes, but I guess I'm not as smart as I think I am, because I accepted and gave him my address. He said he'd pick me up around 7 p.m. the next day, and man, was he really happy. I told all my friends where we were going, and they told me I was an idiot for giving my address to a guy I'd never met. I thought everyone was jealous, so I didn't take their comments seriously. I started getting ready around 6 o'clock, and at exactly 7 the bell rang. I opened the door and was immediately disappointed by what I saw. It looked nothing like his photos. Well, not exactly at all. He was obviously the same person, but at least 10 or 15 years older. I didn't say anything and thought I'd go on the date and see how it went, because I still liked her texting persona. He opened the door for me, circled around the car to the other side, and got in. We started driving towards a restaurant, which was about 30 minutes away. She told me how beautiful she thought I was and that she was even prettier than in my photos. And then, very awkwardly, she said, "What about me? Am I even more handsome than in my photos?" At first I thought he was joking. It had to be like this, right? There was no way I didn't know I was a lot less attractive than in the photos. I didn't really know what to say, but my mom always told me to be honest, so I decided that a half-truth was better than nothing. I told him he looked good, but then I became curious about how long it had been since he had taken those photos. It was obvious right away that he was offended by the question, so I quickly apologized and told him to forget that he had ever asked. I was hoping we could put that behind us, but he clearly took it very personally and kept giving me the silent treatment for the next 5 minutes, like a big baby. I had really started to regret the decision to date him, and I definitely regretted giving him my address. I knew the way to the restaurant, so I was aware of where we were going as he drove. I noticed he missed the street where he was located and told him to just make a U-turn at the next intersection, but he didn't respond. The next intersection passed, and I started to get a little nervous. I told him again that I needed to turn around, and again I received no response. I was driving down the road, and I asked him over and over again what he was doing and where we were going, but he refused to even look at me. We stopped at the traffic lights, and I knew I had to get out of that car. I tried to open the door, but I saw that it was locked. There was no button to unlock it, and it was one of those locks that retract inside the door, so I couldn't even do it manually. I was trapped. I pulled out my phone and, as discreetly as I could, texted my friend with my location. After driving for a while, Nathaniel pulled into an empty parking lot outside a grocery store. He parked in a spot at the far end of the lot. I didn't know exactly what I planned to do, but I had an idea that I wasn't going to let that happen. He took off his seatbelt, and I reached for my bag. He grabbed my arms and tried to hold me. I fought him and tried with all my might to keep him away from me. Finally, he let go of my arm, and I pulled out my pepper spray and sprayed it directly in the face. The only problem with using the pepper spray in such an enclosed space is that I ended up putting it on myself as well. My eyes began to burn and cry as he screamed in the seat next to me. He started calling me everything while trying to wipe his face with his shirt. And during the fight, I managed to catch up with him and unlock the doors. I slammed it open, fell to the ground, scraping my knees in the process, and at that moment I had difficulty seeing clearly, and my chest had begun to burn from breathing the fumes from the pepper spray. I tried to stand up, but I was so dizzy that I kept falling to the ground. I stumbled as I was slowly making my way toward the lot. I heard his door open, and he was yelling at me to come back. I looked back, and through all the confusion and tears I saw him stumbling as he followed me. I screamed for help, but there was no one around to hear my screams. Nathaniel started saying that he was just joking and didn't want to scare me. He said that if I got back in the car with him, we would go to the restaurant as planned, and that he was sorry, and he said this between screams of pain from his burning eyes. It was scary, and I really wondered if I thought I was really going to believe him and get back in the car with him. Was he really that stupid? He was close behind me in no time, and just as I got to the doors of the grocery store, he grabbed my shoulders and pulled me back. But the doors had already opened, and I screamed for my life. I saw a man running outside, and he told Nathaniel to get away from me, which he did immediately, and the man helped me up and tried to restrain Nathaniel there, but there was no way to stop him from getting back into his car and leaving quickly. The police were called at that point and told me they would open an investigation, but nothing ever happened, and believe it or not, This guy was never found. I moved out of that house I was living in at the time and went back to live with my parents. I started getting really paranoid for a while, thinking I'd find myself, but it still hasn't happened. I now use my story as a warning to other women who are going down the same path I once did. Even you men never know who wants to hurt you, but it can and does happen. So please be careful. Story 3. My girlfriend and I are the adventurous type. We like to get out of the house as much as possible and do literally any outdoor activity we can. This time we decided late on the day that we wanted to go camping for about a week. Neither of us has the typical fixed schedule job, and the best way to explain it is that we basically work for ourselves in terms of our scheduling, but in the grand scheme of things we work for a larger company. We packed our things and headed towards a campground, which is a state park where you can camp for free for up to 14 days without the need for permits or approval. We were driving down a dirt road for a while, and I made the horrible mistake of not turning on the high beams. I don't know why. Something I hadn't thought of doing, and it would turn out to be something I would regret for the rest of my life. It also didn't help that he was going too fast for the terrain and the time of night. Within seconds, my girlfriend screamed, and just a few feet in front of the truck, we both saw a large fallen tree in the middle of the road. There was little I could do other than hit the brakes and hope we could stop before we hit the tree. Of course, we weren't that lucky. We crashed into the tree, and I was out for a couple of seconds. I remember waking up very sleepy, and the ringing in my ears was very intense. But my top priority was to make sure my girlfriend was okay. To simplify the story, I'll just call her Evangelina. I looked at Evangelina, and she was completely unconscious. It was night, but the moon was illuminating his face enough to see that his eyes were closed. I shouted her name to try to wake her up, but she wasn't responding at all. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at her. I didn't really know what to expect, but what I saw was something I definitely couldn't have foreseen at all. I saw the blood first. He was wearing a white shirt, so it was quite evident, and then, of course, I noticed a tree branch running across his chest. It wasn't a huge branch. It was probably the same diameter as a finger or something. I know it's a weird comparison, but I can't really think of anything else to compare it, that it went through the windshield and was still attached to the tree. I didn't want to shake her because I didn't want to cause more trauma to her body in the process of trying to wake her up, so I didn't even touch her. I tried to call 911, but there was no service. I began to think about what I could do to help her, but there were so few options. The truck wouldn't even start, so even if driving was the right idea, it wasn't an option. I had a knife in my pocket. So the next logical solution in my mind was to cut the tree branch and try to get it out of the truck and lay it on the side of the road so I could get help, knowing that someone wasn't going to crash into our truck and only make things worse. I climbed onto the hood of the car and tried as hard as I could to cut through that branch, but the knife was small and wasn't moving forward at all. I started to panic. More than 30 minutes had already passed, and she still hadn't woken up. I went back to the truck and just started praying, which was strange to me since I hadn't prayed since I was a child. But at this point I was willing to try anything. I felt I was praying for hours, but it had only been another 30 minutes. I was only holding on to this glimmer of hope because I wasn't actively bleeding during that hour. The branch wasn't in the center of his chest, so he hoped it had bypassed his heart. I felt his pulse, and it wasn't strong, but it was still there. All I could do was wait for someone to come by and hopefully help us. I don't know if it was God or luck, but I began to see light coming from behind us. I was filling the inside of the truck, and I got out as quickly as possible and started yelling and shaking the driver. He pulled up right behind our truck and rolled down the window, asking what was wrong. I started to explain quickly, and he told me to calm down since he couldn't understand me. I explained more slowly, and the expression on his face changed instantly, when he realized what I was saying. He got out of his truck and went to the passenger side door with his flashlight and pointed it at Evangelina. I heard him curse under his breath, and he told me that the only hope I would be to cut the branch and try to drive it to the emergency station, since he didn't have service either. He had a chainsaw in the back of his truck and was terrified that the movement of the branch would cause him even more pain, but there really was no other option. He began sawing about half a meter in front of his chest. I covered it with a blanket to try to minimize sawdust from entering the wound. Her body vibrated a little, but she wasn't conscious, so at least she didn't feel pain. At least that's what she thought. Finally, she was free of the tree. The man helped me lift her as gently as possible, and we placed her in the back seat of his truck, lying down. I climbed into the passenger seat, and the man turned around and started going down the mountain. Evangelina remained unconscious the entire time. It took us 20 minutes to get to the ER station that I didn't even know was there. They were surprised to see us, as they're usually called for emergencies. They loaded her into an ambulance, and I got in with her. The nearest hospital wasn't too far away, thank goodness, but it wasn't a trauma center. So she had to be transferred by helicopter to the larger city that was about an hour away. He had a punctured lung, but fortunately he hadn't lost much blood, and his heart wasn't damaged at all. The doctor said that if he had been only an inch to the left, he would have punctured his heart and probably died within minutes of the accident. She was in a coma for almost 2 weeks, and when she finally woke up, she could barely speak due to the pain she felt in her chest. He stayed in the hospital for more than 2 months and had intensive surgery to try to repair all the damage, but he may even need a lung transplant in the future. I am grateful that Evangelina survived and have kept in touch with the man who saved her life. Evangelina is still using oxygen and has difficulty breathing from time to time. I take her to monthly appointments, and we're doing our best to hopefully see her make a full recovery one day, though we've accepted the fact that that may never happen. I asked him to marry me while I was still in the hospital, and he said yes, and no matter what, I'm looking forward to spending the rest of our lives together. I'll never forget that night, and I often have a hard time forgiving myself for what happened. But I'm also glad it's something she doesn't have to remember. Story 4. I wasn't really planning to tell this story, but it's been a few years and I'm not as scared of what happened as I used to be. So why not? He was only 19 years old at the time. I moved across the country the year before to go to college and had never had a problem driving home during breaks we had throughout the school year. It was winter break time, and my mom really wanted me to go home that year to celebrate the holidays with my family, since I hadn't been there the year before. I agreed, but I really didn't want to leave my car parked for weeks. There had been a lot of car break-ins in the city I lived in, and leaving my car to be vandalized, stolen, or vandalized was simply not an option for me. I told my mom I was going to drive home, and she wasn't too happy about it, but she understood. He offered to have my dad fly and drive with me, but I didn't want them to go through all that trouble, and I thought a few days on the road on my own would be a good thing. I had been having problems in my personal life, and having time to think about it without distractions seemed like a positive thing to me. I packed a few bags that would last me the next few weeks and said goodbye to my roommate, who was quite sad about my departure, and headed for the door. Looking back, now my car probably wasn't worth it for what I went through during that trip home. It was a 20-year-old Honda Civic that had a tendency to break down a lot. And by a lot, I mean at least once a month. I just didn't have the money to replace it. I got in the car and within a few minutes, I was on the highway. I had a coffee before I left the city, so I could stay awake as long as possible. It was still around 8 in the morning, so I figured I'd drive for about 10 hours before finding hopefully a hotel and settling down for the night. I had no definite plans and was following the fastest route home, which probably wasn't the best decision. I know now that I should have taken the route that didn't involve long stretches of highway with nothing but fields for miles and miles. I made a few stops to go to the bathroom and grab snacks, and by 7 p.m., I was done. I had been driving for almost 11 hours, and I didn't want to be a danger to myself or others on the road if I kept driving being so exhausted. I found a relatively nice hotel and got a room for the night, and continued my journey the next morning. That day I was going to be driving through parts of the Midwest, and it wasn't something I necessarily expected. The last time I passed through, it was a lot of just flat land and cornfields, both of which I found boring to see on a long road trip. However, it was winter, so there was no corn. The weather could have been better, but I had no problems the day before, so I expected it to stay that way. The day passed faster than the previous one, and the sun went down before I knew it. By 6 p.m., I was feeling pretty good to keep going, so I passed to the next town and kept driving. Around 7, I started hearing a knocking sound and wanted to cry when I realized it was coming from my engine, and it started snowing, and my car started to move slowly down the road until I stopped on the side of the road where it completely shut down. It was starting to get cold without the heater on, and I knew I had to get help very soon. I checked Google Maps to see if it was close to another city, but the next city, although very small, was still almost an hour away. I tried to call my parents to tell them what had happened, but my service was completely out of order. I decided to use the emergency call button on my phone to ask for help, and thank goodness it worked. The only problem was that the nearest officer who could answer was at least an hour away in the city I mentioned earlier. I told the dispatcher that I would obviously wait, and she instructed me to close the doors and try to hide inside the car long enough to make it look like no one was inside. Apparently, right where my car decided to drop me off was also a very suspicious section of the highway that wasn't very safe for stranded drivers, especially young women. I'm not gonna lie, having the dispatcher tell me that made me feel physically bad. I felt like I was gonna have a heart attack with the speed my heart was beating. I put a sunshade in the windshield area, and luckily I had 3 extras in the car from when I went car camping, and I decided to put them on the sides and back of the windshield, as well so no one could see it, and it would look almost black from the outside. About 30 minutes after waiting, I began to feel the sensation that someone was watching me. I tried to convince myself that it was just because of the situation I was in, and that all the windows were covered anyway, so there was no way that was possible. I wanted to shake it off, but the feeling just wouldn't go away, no matter how much he told me it was okay. There was something inside me that told me that the situation I was in was going to become very, very scary. I turned on my phone screen and faced it toward the windows, not knowing that what I was about to see would traumatize me for years. At first, I felt some relief seeing only the reflection of the sunshade. I turned my phone towards the windows on the passenger side, and in the small crack that was not covered, to my horror, a window strip was visible, and on the other side of the window was the face of a man pressed against the glass with a smile looking directly at me. My first reaction was a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound I didn't even know I had the ability to make. It was as if fear itself manifested in sound. It almost pierced my ears, and the second the scream came out of my mouth, I saw the man lift his face from the glass and hear him begin to laugh. The most terrible, guttural laughter I had ever heard. I immediately heard the sound of the car as the man violently tried to open the door to get in. He was screaming and crying as he threw himself around the car, howling like some animal in his laughter. I felt like he was provoking me in some way. I called 911 again and yelled that I needed help now. The woman who answered the second time was not as kind as the first one he had spoken to only 30 minutes before. He kept yelling at me to stop screaming, otherwise he wouldn't be able to help me. I was crying, trying to calm myself down as best I could as the man outside began banging on my window with what sounded like a hard object that could possibly break my car glass. The dispatcher began to threaten me, telling me that it was not okay to make jokes on the 9/11, although I insisted that what was happening was very real. After 10 minutes of sheer agony trying to make her understand, while the man right outside my car was subjecting me to this, he hung up on me, and I felt completely helpless. And at that moment, the only relief I felt was the fact that I hadn't been able to get into my car. I called 911 again, hoping the dispatcher would have more empathy, and thankfully it was the case. A man answered and immediately took my distress into account and helped me calm down enough to get the information I needed. The officer had been dispatched nearly 45 minutes earlier and was now only about 10 minutes away. They told me that he would arrive as quickly as possible given the circumstances he was experiencing. I had hope, but that hope was ripped away when I heard the sound of what was obviously a rock being thrown at my windshield. It broke enough to motivate the man to climb onto the hood of my car and start stomping on the windshield until it broke enough for me to get a hand in. I screamed and climbed into the back seat, trying as best I could to get out of reach of this very crazy and clearly dangerous person. They began to rip the windshield out of the way, and his face was even more terrifying than the first time I saw him. I was paralyzed with fear as I watched him begin to climb between the windows towards the car. I had no choice but to get out of the car and wait for the officer to be nearby. I opened the door and turned on my phone's flashlight. I directed it towards the hood, and I was so relieved to see that it had stuck. He tried to get out but couldn't. Then I saw the beautiful red and blue lights flickering in the distance and heard the sirens as they approached. I began frantically shaking the officer, and he stopped next to me in seconds. Another police car pulled up behind him just a few minutes later. They put me in one of the police cars, and I saw how they actually pulled out their guns demanding that the man get out of the car. This crazy guy was screaming and shaking his body. One of the officers grabbed him by the ankles and pulled him out of the vehicle. The man tried to bite him several times before being thrown to the ground and handcuffed. They put it in the back of the other car and told me that more officers would come to take pictures of the scene and that a tow truck would come to take my car. They took me to the police station, and I gave my statement about everything that happened. I called my parents, who bought me a plane ticket back from the nearest airport, which the officers were kind enough to take me to. I wish I could tell you who the man was who did that to me and give a reason why, but there wasn't. He was so mentally disturbed that they said he was not even fit to be tried eventually, and I assumed he was taken to some state mental hospital where, last I heard, he is still there. I wish there was some justice for the hell he put me through, and maybe some people would say there was, but for me it wasn't justice. He's not being punished, it's me. The memory of what happened punishes me every day. It's gotten easier to deal with as time goes on, but it'll always be there to haunt me whenever I remember that man in the window. Story 5. I was driving my truck back home from my girlfriend's apartment. There was a pretty strong storm that night, but I figured since I only lived 10 minutes away I'd be fine. I would have stayed at his house, but I had to work early the next day and all my work clothes were at my house. It was dark and the power had gone out. Driving in complete darkness with only the headlights to illuminate the road is not the most comfortable feeling. The rain was pounding the windshield so hard that my wipers couldn't even go fast enough for me to see in front of me. It was like driving blind, but I had lived in that city all my life, so I knew where to go. It was like it was a muscle memory about where to turn and how long to drive down the street. I turned onto the road where my house was, and almost immediately I could tell that something was not right. It was as if my truck was floating almost. I felt moisture on my feet, and the lights started flashing inside the van. There was water seeping through my headlights, and I could see the water rising higher and higher outside my truck. The water was coming in faster, and the truck was sinking into it. The current carried my truck further inside, and there was nothing I could do. I took off my seatbelt and tried to open the door on the side, but it didn't move. The water was knee-high now, and I took deep breaths. My dad always told me not to panic in a scary situation because panic won't save your life. I had a waterproof flashlight in my glove compartment and pulled it out. I turned it on and looked for something that could break the window with. By then, the car had completely shut down and power windows were not an option. I had only cleaned the van the day before, and unfortunately that meant getting all my tools out so I could organize my box. I only had my sweater, the small flashlight, and a pocket knife at my disposal. I called 911 and was greeted by a recorded message telling me that each dispatcher was busy on a call and that they would get to me as soon as possible. And that's when I started to panic. He needed help, and it seemed that he was not going to receive any. The water was now in my abdomen when I decided to squat in my seat and try to keep my head above the water for as long as possible. The water seemed to be coming mostly through the driver's door, so I grabbed my sweater and tried to plug the leak, but it didn't work. But he was desperate and willing to try everything. I was on hold for 7 minutes before I finally got a response. I told them what was going on, and they were very direct in telling me that I wasn't the only person in that kind of flood situation, and that it would be at least 30 minutes before they could come to help me. I kept telling them that I felt like I didn't have 30 minutes, but they told me there was nothing else they could do. I asked if they would stay on the line with me, but they said that due to the demand for emergency services during the storm, they needed as many dispatchers as they could get, and if the situation worsened, I could call again. I hung up with the dispatcher, and I already knew that wouldn't be an option if the situation got worse. I wouldn't have 7 minutes to wait on hold and tell someone about it. He would be dead. The water kept rising, and my heart was beating faster. I was scared and confused as to why I wasn't getting help, and neither my mom nor dad were answering their phones. I opened the voice recorder app and started recording my goodbyes to my family. I wasn't sure if they would get them, but it was better than nothing and somehow calmed my nerves. It was as if I was talking to them without literally speaking to them. But something about it was a little therapeutic at the time. Just 10 minutes after hanging up with the 911, the water had begun to reach my chest. I was sure I was going to die. When only a small space in the car had room for air, I began to pray to God to please not let me die, but if I did, let me go to heaven. I hadn't been very religious in my adult life up until that exact point, but I guess that's how it usually is. You realize your true belief in God when you really need Him. Anyway, another 5 minutes passed and the water reached my neck. Her cheek was resting on the ceiling, and she couldn't help crying. I was starting to lose hope. No one was coming for me. I could only breathe through my nose when I heard the sound of an engine nearby. I didn't think they would even notice my truck, so I started screaming and turning on my flashlight to get their attention. I felt a sense of relief when I heard a boat approaching my truck. I focused my flashlight and saw someone jump into the water by the window on my driver's side. It had a glass breaker and it broke on the first try. He reached out the truck and grabbed my shirt. I took a deep breath as I pulled out of the truck through the window. They put me on the boat, and I began to thank them profusely for saving my life, while I breathed deeply the air that minutes before I thought was about to run out. They wrapped me in an emergency blanket and we left. We helped get a few more people out of the cars before we reached an area where police and firefighters were waiting. They took me to the hospital, but I had nothing medically wrong with me. Thank God. Thankfully, no one died during that storm, although I know I came very close to being the only victim. I felt so failed by my city's emergency services and found out that night that the people who saved me weren't even police officers. They were just good Samaritans who heard that some people were in trouble and knew they had help. 4 months after the incident, I had nightmares about drowning. Even now, I'm afraid to drive during a storm or even go out on a boat. The deep water terrifies me. I went to therapy a few times, but it never seemed to help, so I just stopped going. I just hope that there will be a day, hopefully soon, when I can completely get over what happened and not let it torment me like it does now. I'm glad I survived, and I'm thankful that people in my community stepped in when the police didn't. It should never have been left there to die, and that's exactly what they ended up doing. I just hope that no one else finds themselves in the same position, and if they do, I hope that someone rescues them in time and that their life is saved like mine that night. Story 6. He had just finished a nearly 24-hour shift. I worked in construction, and management had no problem making us work too hard if there was a deadline and we weren't close enough to finishing. We were paid overtime. So many of us were fine with that. I was driving home from work sites, and since it was close to 3 in the morning, there weren't many other cars on the road. I must admit that I was too tired to really drive. I had been awake for almost 40 hours in total, and yes, I was being reckless, but I wanted to get home and just sleep. I was falling asleep several times during the drive home, but I would always wake up right away to see a little girl sitting alone on the side of the road. I went through it at first, but my gut told me to turn around and see if I needed help. I stopped next to her, and she looked at me. He couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old. I asked him what was wrong or if he needed help, but he didn't say anything. I felt it was wrong to leave her there, so I opened my car door and told her to get in, and I wasn't going to hurt her. I was a little hesitant at first, but it went up anyway. He planned to take her to the nearest police station, so they could hopefully find who she was and take her back to her family. I tried numerous times to get her to tell me something about her, but she didn't say anything and instead kept looking at me. His eyes were fixed on me the whole time. We drove in silence for another 10 minutes when I saw another child sitting on the side of the road. I felt like I was going crazy. It couldn't be that this was happening again. I stopped, and this time it was a little boy, and it wasn't saying anything either. I thought, why not get in a car? And he did so without hesitation. I started asking her the same questions I asked the girl, but like her, she didn't speak and just stared at me. I started to get a little scared and worried that I had gotten into something very, very serious, but I knew I had to help these kids no matter what. I started thinking about what it could be. Were they kidnapped and then abandoned on the side of the road? Was it a human trafficking situation? Were they lost? I had no idea. Another 15 minutes passed, and it happened again, but this time there was a car seat on the side of the road. I stopped and was horrified to see a baby inside. He couldn't tell his age, but he seemed relatively healthy. He was looking at me, and I knew I had to take him with me to the police station, and I put the car seat in the back of the car and called the police as soon as I had a signal. They instructed me to go to the hospital that was a few miles away and that they would meet me there. We arrived shortly after the call and stopped at the entrance. I took the car seat out and motioned for the kids to follow me inside, and they did so without saying a word or making a scene. I walked in, and there was only the receptionist there. I explained what was going on, but the only response I received was a very confused look on his face. I motioned for the children to come to her, and they just stood by her side. I kept asking her for help, but she just looked around and didn't do anything. And I didn't understand why I was wondering over and over again if I was okay, and I didn't know why I told her it was okay, but that the kids needed help and the baby seemed to be cold. He asked me over and over again what children I was saying, and no matter how much I pointed to them or told them where they were, he acted like he had no idea what I was talking about. I was getting frustrated, and at this point I had no idea what to do. He told me to repeat, and I just told him again exactly what had happened. The whole time I told the story, she just looked where I was pointing at them, but something was wrong. It was as if I was looking through the children instead of looking at them. Just as I was finishing the story, 2 officers came in. I told the story again to these officers, who were just as confused as she was. They were looking around for the children who were standing right in front of them, and then I was confused too. They made me sit down and very calmly told me that there were no children with me, and that I was carrying a bag of tools, not a car seat. I looked down and still saw the car seat in my hand and the children standing nearby, and begged them to give them help and reunite them with their families. But they were firm and very serious about what they were telling me. They told me over and over again that there was no one there and that I was having some kind of episode. I had never had mental health problems, and I told him so, but it didn't matter. They admitted me for a 72-hour cycle because they thought I might be a possible danger to myself or others with the hallucinations I was having. They were worried mainly because I was so sure of what I was saying. I thought everyone was crazy and that I was the only one who was sane. Over the next few days, I had a lot of tests and evaluations done to try to figure out what was wrong with me. At first, they thought it was because of lack of sleep. It is common for people to hallucinate because of lack of sleep, but when the hallucinations continued even after hours of sleep, they knew there was something more. I was afraid. I called my mom, who came and went through our family's medical story with the doctors, and after the 72 hours passed, I decided to stay in the hospital. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I needed help. For the next 2 weeks before my diagnosis, children followed me everywhere, watching me sleep, keeping me company, but still not talking. At first they were comforting, as if I wasn't alone. But eventually they became a reminder that something was wrong with me and I couldn't lead a normal life until they figured out what it was. However, hallucinations were no longer my only symptom. I started having trouble speaking and couldn't think clearly, and that alerted the doctors that it might be something else. They did scans on me, but they didn't see anything. I was told that if the last MRI they were going to do during that particular stay didn't show anything, I would have to leave and come back on another date for more scans they hoped to show more. I knew what they meant if I had any kind of brain tumor. I didn't want to wait for it to grow before they could do anything about it. We did the MRI, and fortunately, one of the doctors, among the many who were there, noticed a shadow. I had a brain tumor. It was small, but it explained all my symptoms. It was determined to be a malignant tumor in the frontal lobe that was compressing the optic nerve, and unfortunately, it wasn't something they could operate on due to its proximity to the optic nerve, but they were hopeful that chemotherapy and radiation therapy would kill the cancer cells since it had been detected so early. I started chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and after a few weeks, the hallucinations occurred less frequently. Part of me missed them when they weren't around, but most of me was happy because it meant I was getting better. Most people probably wouldn't understand it, but maybe some would. I am still in treatment, and my doctors are hopeful that I will be in remission soon. I'm grateful for what happened that night. If I hadn't seen those kids on the road, hallucination or not, I would never have gone to the hospital, and they would never have discovered cancer so early. I'm still not sure about my official prognosis, but I like to think it's a good one. I have to have hope, otherwise I have nothing. Story 7. I was 16 years old and had just gotten my license. Think of the typical 16-year-old self-absorbed idiot. Yes, that was me. It was Friday night, and I was begging my mom to let me drive the car to meet friends and hang out. But she was adamant that wasn't going to happen. He kept saying he was probably going to go out drinking and didn't want him to be an idiot and drive drunk. I kept telling her I wouldn't, but she stood by her decision. I told her I hated her and went to my room, determined to make my own decision to leave later and take the car with me. It was around 11 o'clock at night. My mom was asleep in bed, and I didn't have to worry about my dad hearing me because I was out of town. I opened my window, jumped out in front of the garden, and had already taken the keys earlier in the evening. So as quickly and quietly as I could, I got in the car and drove off. My mom had forced me to install Life 360 on my phone, so I simply turned it off to prevent her from knowing where I was if she realized I was gone. She was the type of mom who would call the police to get me if I wasn't home when I was supposed to be. I texted my friends to ask where they were, and of course, they had gone to Los Angeles. I was over an hour away from where they were, but I hate to say it, I still decided to go. I was on the freeway for a while because of the traffic and decided to take some side streets in hopes it would go faster. It really wasn't, but that's life in Southern California. Traffic everywhere all the time. Eventually, I got lost and didn't want to turn on my phone to see a map, so I tried to get to a highway to hopefully find my way back home. Time passed so quickly, and the later it did, the more lost I felt. It's not easy to admit, but I was scared and, honestly, I loved my mom. I was going down back roads, alleys, and through neighborhoods that didn't seem very safe, not really thinking about my own well-being. I turned onto another narrow street and was surprised to see a truck blocking the road. It was parked on its side, as if it were deliberate. I tried to back up, but I came across a man who was now pointing a gun at my face, banging on my window. I started sweating and didn't know what to do, so I did as I was told. He told me to open the door and get out, so I did. He pulled me out of the car and pushed me to the ground. Another guy ran up to me and started hitting me so hard that I thought my stomach was going to split open from the force of each punch. He begged them to stop and screamed for help. A few more guys stood by and watched as he continued to beat me. He was lying there, completely helpless. All I wanted as I lay on that ground was for my dad to come and save me. I knew it was impossible, but the thought of seeing my parents again gave me some hope of getting out of there alive. I realized that the end of the beating would not come quickly, so I went into a stable and raised my arms to protect my head and face. But in doing that, it gave him the idea to start stomping on my face. The second my arms were raised, his foot fell right into my jaw. The pain I felt was minimal at the time. Something I realized later was because of the surge of adrenaline in my body. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he stopped. I think they thought I had passed out, but I didn't. I was simply unable to move any part of my body. I saw flashes of light through my eyelids and realized they were taking pictures of me, as if they were proud of what they had done. They laughed as they reached into my pockets. They took my keys, wallet, and phone, and all I could think about was how much I wished I had listened to my mom and stayed home. I remember being there as the pain began to infiltrate my body. My jaw was the thing that hurt the most. It felt like it was broken. I was able to open my eyes, and in the dim light, I saw all the blood scattered on my body on the asphalt. I tried to get up, but the pain was too much. I felt tears streaming down my face as I began to realize that there was a strong chance that I would die right there, alone on a random street, knowing that the last thing I had said to my mom was that I hated her. I didn't hate her. What I wanted most as I lay on that floor was for my mom to be there with me, getting me help and telling me that everything would be okay. I must have lost consciousness because the next thing I remember is the paramedics waking me up and asking me my name and what had happened. I was still lying in the middle of the road when they started loading me onto a stretcher while the ambulance waited to take me to the nearest hospital. I could barely speak, but I managed to tell them my name before passing out again. I guess I woke up in the hospital a week later with my jaw wired. Apparently, he had broken from the stomp on his face. My mom was sitting by my bedside in the hospital when I woke up and cried as I told her and the police the details of what had happened. They said he was probably part of some gang initiation and was lucky to be alive. The doctors told me the same thing while describing my injuries. He had several broken ribs, as well as a mass of internal bleeding from being kicked in the torso so many times. In addition to the broken jaw, he had a broken nose and other extremely painful facial fractures. The scariest injury of all was the discovery that my Achilles tendons had been severed. To this day, no one can tell me why they did it or why I didn't feel it when it happened. I had to have surgery on both ankles and still face the possibility of more surgeries and physical therapy before I could even think about walking normally again. I had to stay in the hospital for months before I was allowed to go home. I feel so stupid about what I did, but what happened to me was literally the worst possible scenario of what can happen when you take your parents' car as a teenager. I'm not telling this story to make you think that this is what happens when you disobey your parents. This is not common. I guess I just want to say that sometimes your parents really do know better, and when they tell you no or that something isn't a good idea, it really is because they care about you. They know more than you do and don't take their life experience, wisdom, and unconditional love for granted. Story 8. I am a single mother. I know a lot of people will roll their eyes reading that, but it's important to the story, so don't judge too harshly. The story I'm going to tell happened when I was in my late 30s and my 2 daughters were 14 and 16. I had just come out of an intense custody battle with her father, but thankfully I was granted full custody due to her drug addiction and unstable financial situation. My daughters and I were very excited to move to another state, away from all the drama that the custody battle had caused. There was a lot of taking sides and blame being thrown, even by my daughters, so we decided that getting out of that toxic environment was in our best interest. It was early June and the weather was beginning to warm up. We had just packed the last boxes of our house and decided to leave a few days before the moving truck because we wanted to settle into the house before all our stuff arrived. Even though there was no furniture for a few days, we were fine with it. We said goodbye to our old house, which was very exciting for us, and we left. We were going the fast route, and according to Google, it would only take a couple of days to get to the new house. We had the idea of staying in a hotel one night on the road, which we were very excited about. My daughters love staying in hotels, like most kids, and I love seeing them happy after hours of driving. It was late in the afternoon, and we were ready to get out of the car and find a room to stay. I checked all the hotels in the area, all the apps, and there was nothing available. There literally wasn't a spare room in any of the surrounding cities for another 3 days. I phoned, and apparently there was a huge children's soccer tournament in town, and it was one of the biggest in the country. We decided to keep driving until we found something, but instead, we came across a stretch of road that had many rest points but no hotels. We stopped at the gas station to get gas, and I noticed some guys on motorcycles in the parking lot. As I waited at the pump, I noticed that one of the men was clearly looking into the back seat of my car, where my daughters were sleeping. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I instantly had this hunch to get them out of there. It just didn't seem like a great situation to be in. A young single mother with her teenage daughters, not very good. I didn't even wait for him to finish pumping gas. I took it out, closed the tank lid, got back in the car as discreetly as possible, and got back on the highway. I watched to see if they were following us, but they didn't, and I thought maybe I had just been a little paranoid, so I stopped thinking about it. My daughters and I decided to stop at the rest area. We felt it was safe enough because of the time we arrived. There were a lot of other vehicles and people around. I had my daughters cover the back windows with the blankets we had brought, and we all fell asleep around 8 p.m. I intended to sleep for only a few hours before moving on, but I didn't remember to set an alarm. Instead, I was awakened by the loud roar of a motorcycle approaching the side of the car. I don't know what it is like to be a mother, but every sound I hear wakes me up in seconds when my daughters are around. I sat down and looked out the window and was terrified to see the same men from the gas station just a few parking spots away. And they weren't alone. There were at least 25 or 30 of them now. I was pretty sure we hadn't been seen, so I decided not to wake the girls. I didn't want to scare them. I turned on the car and the headlights, but no matter how hard I tried to get out of there without being noticed, it just wasn't going to happen. Something in the universe wanted those bikers to see my car and recognize it quickly, and the moment my lights came on, all heads turned and stared directly at us. I hoped that the men at the gas station wouldn't realize that they had already seen us, but of course, that wasn't the case. I heard one of them shout to his friends who knew us, and that we were a pair of beauties in the back seat. I was immediately scared, but I also rolled my eyes because who says that? Especially about two clearly underage teenagers. But then again, they didn't seem to be the kind of people who wouldn't mind that sort of thing. Honestly, I thought if I left, it would be like last time, where they wouldn't follow us, but now they were following us quickly. I woke up the girls and wish I had been one of those moms who sugarcoat things to keep their kids from freaking out, but there was no way to do it with what was going on. I told them that we were being followed by some terrifying men, and they stayed downstairs where no one could see them and kept the blankets on the windows. They both began to panic and cry, and I understood as I sped down the highway. These motorcyclists became more aggressive. They started throwing things at my car and swerving as they tried to run us off the road. I was doing my best to stay calm on the outside, so I wouldn't scare the girls more than they already were. But inside, I was having a total panic attack. I knew that my top priority had to be to stay in control of my car. It was clear that if something happened when they managed to get us off the road, nothing good would come out of it. They started yelling at me to just stop and that they just wanted to chat. I kept looking straight ahead, outside the windshield, and I didn't even recognize them, but they didn't like that. They started insulting me and demanding that I roll down the window. I lowered it a few inches to try to beg them to just stop and leave us alone, but there was no way they could hear me. We drove like this for at least 9 kilometers before entering the next city, and by that time it was already 2 in the morning. Finally, I came to myself and told my oldest daughter to just call the police. Through tears, she told them what was happening. I don't know what they told her, but she said they were coming. Unfortunately, they just didn't come soon enough. I felt something hit the side of the car, and within seconds, we were off the road and heading toward a tree. I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could, and the car came to a violent stop. We were all fine, but I began to wonder for how long. The motorists surrounded us and began banging on the windows and pulling on the door handles as the car shook. The girls were screaming at the top of their lungs and begging me to make them leave, but there really wasn't anything I could do. I prayed to God that we could get out of there, and thank God, He answered my prayers. We heard sirens in the distance and watched as the men climbed back onto their motorcycles and sped away. We hugged and cried until the officers were standing in the car doors. We had to go out and explain everything. They attempted to contact motorcyclists in that area, but were unable to track them down specifically, at least not that day. But to this day, I'm still terrified every time I see a group of bikers. My daughters are older now, with children of their own, and my biggest advice to them is to always wear protection. You never know when you're going to find yourself in a situation as psychotic as that.